Tennessee is one of the most prominent states in the U.S. today. It's the birthplace of country music, home to the Great Smoky Mountains, and one of the most culturally distinct regions of the South. But here's a twist. Long before Tennessee came to exist, another much smaller state almost claimed the land. A state you won't find on modern maps, but one that briefly flickered into life in the 1780s. It was called Franklin. So, what was this lost state? Why did it appear, and why did it ultimately collapse? As with so many stories in American history, it begins with geography, specifically the formidable Appalachian Mountains, a land shaped by barriers and rivers. Before a state can be born, there must first be a place, a landscape so distinct that it molds the people who live there. Franklin's story is rooted in a rugged corner of what is now northeastern Tennessee, where mountains, valleys, and rivers dictated everything from settlement patterns to survival. For settlers in the late 1700s, the Appalachians weren't just pretty rolling hills for a scenic drive. They were a towering barrier, a great wall of stone and forest separating the old colonial seaboard from the dangerous promise of the frontier. The Blue Ridge Mountains in particular were the first great obstacle, and yet people crossed. They trickled through gaps like the Cumberland Gap, carried dreams of land, freedom, and second chances. On the western slopes of the Blue Ridge, they became known as the Over-Mountain People. These settlers lived technically within the boundaries of North Carolina, but in reality, they were worlds away. News, laws, tax collectors, even soldiers, all moved at a snail's pace, if they moved at all, across those ridges. The mountains acted like a natural sieve, filtering out the influence of Raleigh and New Bern. What remained was a culture of independence and grit. These weren't just transplanted Carolinians. They were forging a new identity, built on self-reliance. They built forts against raids, ran their own courts, and defended themselves when needed. And if the mountains formed the walls of Franklin, the rivers were its lifelines. The Watauga, Nolichucky, and Holston rivers carried corn, tobacco, and wheat along their banks. Flatboats and canoes served as floating wagons, linking scattered settlements in a web of trade. Life clung tightly to these valleys, where fertile floodplains provided just enough prosperity for the dream of permanence. To the west loomed another barrier, the Cumberland Plateau, a vast tabletop of rock and forest separating Franklin from Middle Tennessee. This geographic pocket, hemmed in by mountains and plateaus, threaded with rivers, formed the cradle of the would-be state of Franklin. Cast adrift. But geography alone doesn't make a state. For that, you need politics. And politics in post-revolutionary America were messy. The Revolutionary War had left the United States deeply in debt. North Carolina, like many states, was broke. Its western frontier, the land that would become Franklin, was expensive to protect from Cherokee and Creek raids, difficult to govern across the mountains, and produced little in the way of tax revenue. To legislators in Raleigh, the West looked less like an opportunity and more like a burden. So in June 1784, North Carolina made a shocking decision. It gave away the entire Western Territory to the federal government, hoping the Secession would help pay down war debts. For the 25,000 settlers living there, this was abandonment. One day, they were part of North Carolina. The next, they were in limbo, neither under Raleigh's protection nor yet accepted by Congress. No courts, no army, no real government. And in a vacuum like that, people had a choice: drift into lawlessness or create their own order. Birth of Franklin. So, in August 1784, Western delegates gathered in Jonesboro. Their solution? Create a new state. Led by Revolutionary War hero John Sevier, They drafted a constitution, elected leaders, and set up courts and militias. They even picked a name, first Franklin, then changed to Franklin, in a savvy attempt to win the favor of Benjamin Franklin himself. Spoiler: Franklin politely declined their overtures, though he admired their pluck. By March 1785, Franklin was operating like a real state. Sevier was governor. Treaties were signed with Cherokee leaders. Laws were passed, including one allowing debts and salaries to be paid in goods like deer pelts or cornmeal, which sounds strange today, but was practical on a barter-based frontier. For a few years, Franklin felt real. An actual state had been willed into being. Two governments, one land. But the dream quickly unraveled. North Carolina, realizing too late the value of its western lands, revoked the cession in November 1784. Suddenly, two governments claimed the same land. Franklin had its governor, courts, and militias. North Carolina had its own. Settlers were caught in the middle. Imagine being a farmer summoned by both a Franklin judge and a North Carolina judge, or worse, asked to pay taxes twice. Loyalties split families and neighbors apart. The rivalry even crystallized around two men: John Sevier, the fiery Franklinite governor; John Tipton, a loyalist to North Carolina, who became Sevier's bitter rival. This tension climaxed in 1788 with the so-called Battle of Franklin, less a grand battle and more a messy siege at Tipton's farm. Sevier's men surrounded Tipton's house, but bungled the attack. Shots were fired, lives lost, and Sevier's credibility was shattered. Without recognition from Congress, fractured internally, and financially unstable, Franklin's government collapsed by 1789. The legacy, but here's where the story takes a twist. Franklin died, but its ideas lived on. The very demands that fueled Franklin, local control, protection, and representation, forced North Carolina and the U.S. government to rethink how they handled the frontier. In 1790, the land was reorganized as the Southwest Territory, directly governed by Washington's federal government. This time, the settlers weren't ignored. A territorial governor, William Blount, brought structure, law, and security. Settlers poured into the valleys in droves, and by 1796, the population topped 60,000, enough for statehood under the Northwest Ordinance. That year, Tennessee was born. Its very name, adapted from the Cherokee word Tanasi, meaning meeting place, reflected the indigenous roots of the land Franklinites once claimed. And here's the irony. John Sevier, once the rebel governor of Franklin, went on to become the first governor of Tennessee. What if Franklin had survived? Had Franklin succeeded, Tennessee's story would look entirely different. Imagine a tiny mountain state wedged into the South, smaller than West Virginia perhaps, and struggling to survive without the backing of a larger statehood movement. Tennessee itself might never have come together as we know it today. Instead, Franklin's short, turbulent life served as a dress rehearsal, a proof of concept that the frontier could and should govern itself. It failed on paper, but succeeded in spirit. Today, Tennessee thrives with more than 7 million people, yet in its DNA, you can still see Franklin: independence, resilience, and a stubborn belief in carving order out of wilderness. The state of Franklin is long gone, but its ghost lingers every time you cross those mountain valleys where pioneers once dared to create a state of their own.